Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and today's continuation of the What's Next series covers the Atlanta Hawks, who might be the current frontrunner among teams that tanked last season as the team that had the best rebuilding season this year. There might be some teams with better opportunities or possibilities as a free agency destination, but in terms of young talent from the 2018 draft and the possibility of adding more in the 2019 draft, along with the flexibility to continue to build around that talent in the future, they certainly have a bright future, so let's look at some building blocks for them moving forward. First up, of course, is Trae Young, the player that the franchise has attached its long-term dreams to the most. They traded back in last year's draft to select him instead of Luka Doncic and picked up the Mavs' top 5 protected pick this year in exchange, which I'll talk about a lot in the draft section. Things didn't start out great for Young in either Summer League or the beginning of the regular season, as his three-point shooting specifically off the dribble didn't immediately translate to the NBA. But he still showed a ton of promise as a playmaker. Later in the year, however, specifically after the All-Star break, he really came into his own as a scorer as well, and his efficiency jumped as a result. Now, although that is great, he still needs to continue to make strides as an efficient scorer and defender, and they'll need to see a lot more from him over the next few seasons to know that they made the right decision by passing on Doncic. It's also possible that Young's jump in production late in the year had a lot to do with teams really going into tank mode, and as a result, him facing worse competition than in the beginning of the year. But there is still plenty to be excited about with him in Atlanta. Next is John Collins, who missed a good amount of time in the beginning of the season with injuries, but once he came back, he played at a near all-star level, which translated to the team playing better as well. Almost too well, actually, as they ended up winning more games than they really wanted to once Collins came back. His scoring and rebounding numbers evoke some mini Amar'e Stoudemire comparisons, but he also continues to make strides as a three-point shooter, and that will ultimately determine his value to this team. He's undersized and not a good enough rim protector to be an effective full-time 5, but if he can maintain his production and be a league average shooter from the 4 spot to provide spacing, he should be a really good piece for the Hawks moving forward to complement their perimeter talent. Next is another 2018 draft pick, Kevin Huerter. He received big minutes as a rookie, especially later in the season, and his combination of shooting and occasional playmaking looked like a perfect fit alongside Young. However, if both he and Young don't improve as defenders, then they'll almost never be able to be on the floor at the same time if the team plans on getting any stops on the defensive end. Regardless, even if he slightly improves his defensive ability, he should provide value as a shooter off the bench at the very least. Next on the long list of building blocks for the Hawks is Taurean Prince. He had some injury issues and only played in 55 games this season, and the team was reportedly shopping him at the trade deadline as well. But he's still a really effective player when healthy. He's a solid defender, a near 40% three-point shooter, and has a little bit of on-ball shot creation in his game as well. He should be a solid 3-and-D wing for the next 4 to 5 seasons, which is always good to have around, and the reason the Hawks were shopping him at the deadline likely had to do with his free agency situation. He's a 2020 free agent that could demand a significant contract, so they'd rather have moved him for future assets than use up their cap space to re-sign a player that's a few years ahead of their true core of young players. And last up are 2 players that I felt the need to mention that are kind of on the fringes of the building blocks conversation for the Hawks, DeAndre Bembry and Omari Spellman. Bembry is an intriguing player that didn't play in many games in his first 2 seasons, but appeared in all 82 this year and has an interesting game as a playmaking, defensive-minded, high-energy wing, but none of that will really matter too much if he can't progress as a shooter. He's a poor man's Evan Turner type of player at the moment, but he's a consistent three-point shot away from being a valuable rotation wing long-term for the Hawks. And last up is Spellman, and he's a player that I personally was pretty high on during the pre-draft process last offseason as a stretch big with some skill. There was only a small amount of evidence that he will actually project into anything long-term this season, and next year and the following will truly show what kind of potential he has, but I am intrigued enough by his play as a rookie to briefly mention him in this section. Okay, with that covered, let's move on to the draft. You can see the Hawks lottery odds with their own pick on screen, and it's guaranteed to land in the top 9 while also having the 5th best odds overall of ending up at number 1. However, as I mentioned earlier, they do own the Mavs' first-round pick this season if it lands outside of the top 5, and there's a 74% chance that that does happen and they end up with another lottery pick in this draft. If that likely event actually happens, that will be a huge boost to their rebuild. At the time of this video, the draft lottery has not occurred yet, so it's really tough to talk about which prospects the Hawks could end up with, but just know that with their own lottery odds and the likelihood that they end up with another lottery pick within the 9 to 13 range, the possibilities are pretty endless. They could begin next year with Zion or RJ Barrett, plus someone like Cam Reddish or Jarrett Culver, or on the other end of the scale, they could just end up with someone like DeAndre Hunter if the Mavs pick doesn't convey. But either way, they're in a great spot in the draft. Moving on now to free agency, as of right now, the Hawks are on pace for around $57 million in payroll, or about $52 million in salary cap space. Not only that, but they don't have any significant free agents this offseason. The most notable one is Dwayne Dedmon, which tells you all you need to know. So they have all that cap space at their disposal if they choose to use it. And there are a couple of different ways they could go about it. They could technically try and go out and spend big money to make their team competitive right away, but I'd be shocked if that's the route that they go. I'm sure with the amount of space that they have and the young talent on the roster, specifically if their dream draft lottery scenario comes true, they could be pretty good next year with some big free agency acquisitions, but they've given every indication that they're playing the long game with this rebuild. So I would expect them to do just what they did last year in free agency. Sign some younger players to cheap deals to see if they could work out long term, such as Alex Len, and then add in some veterans for leadership for the young guys, such as Vince Carter. That allows them to maintain their flexibility, attempt to add to their young talent base, and still grow and develop their young players while still tanking for the most part. And in my opinion, the Hawks will end up focusing on 2020 free agency rather than this year's primarily. If you look at their payroll moving forward, they have only $15 million in contracts on the books for the 2020 offseason. The contracts for Young, Herter, Collins, and Spellman, and that's it. Now, they will have a bit more than that after bringing in this year's draft pick or picks, but it is still realistic to expect them to have over $70 million in cap space available in the 2020 offseason. However, before I get into that possibility a little bit more, there are some wrinkles to consider. First, they obviously can't take on any long-term money this summer if they want to maximize their 2020 cap space, so they'll have to commit to building a team of mostly one-year deals next season, which shouldn't be a big issue since they'll likely be tanking once again. Also, they have two restricted free agents to deal with in 2020 as well, Taurean Prince and DeAndre Bembry. Prince is the better player and will likely command a relatively big contract by then, which again is likely why they looked into moving him at the deadline this year. They could try and bring him back in 2020 if they wanted to, since that'll likely be their big move summer in free agency anyway, but I wouldn't be shocked if he's traded before then to preserve as much cap space as possible. And then there is Bembry, who's also a 2020 restricted free agent, but won't command nearly as big of a new contract as Prince. If he improves this season as a shooter, I could see the Hawks bringing him back on a relatively cheap deal as a solid wing to add to their other young guys and free agents. But now let's get to the really interesting stuff, how all of this could really work out in the Hawks' favor. Let's just say that they end up with a top 3 pick and they draft RJ Barrett and they get the Mavs pick and pick someone like Cam Reddish with that selection. Those would be 2 good young players to add to their group, and they could be better next year, but I'd imagine they'll still prioritize getting another lottery pick in 2020 before really trying to compete for the playoffs in 2021. So now it's the 2020 offseason. They have Young, Collins, Barrett, for example, Reddish, Herter, and Spellman under contract. Prince and Bembry are free agents, and they have at least $70 million to spend to go along with their own lottery pick and the Cavs pick that is owed to them in 2020 if it lands outside of the top 10. And as they go into free agency, there are some interesting names on the market. The biggest name on the market is obviously Anthony Davis, but I would expect him to re-sign either with the team that trades for him, or I really don't see him as a good fit in Atlanta as a destination. So there's also Draymond Green, Andre Drummond, and even Kristaps Porzingis could be available if he signs a qualifying offer this summer, as has been reported. Now, those high-level free agent possibilities might not be that exciting for Hawks fans, but there are a ton of mid-level guys in that class that they could fill out their roster with, and then count on the young guys to fulfill the star roles on the team. If they put it all together, they could time it just right where their young guys are entering their prime, they have even more picks to add talent around them, a ton of cap space to add veterans, and then go over the cap later on to re-sign their draft picks to extensions in the following off seasons. Now, to be clear, that's the dream scenario for them. There's no guarantee that they'll end up with a top 3 pick in this draft, or that they'll end up with the Mavs pick this year, or that any of their young players turn out to be really good NBA players. But the possibility does at least exist for the Hawks to be true contenders in the Eastern Conference within the next year and a half or so, if everything goes right. Even if a couple of things go wrong, they have given themselves so many assets and possibilities for rebuilding that they have a ton of margin for error for at least building a good playoff team for the next few seasons at the worst. And there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.